Proverbs 18. This is probably one of my own personal favorite chapters in the book of Proverbs. I like it in part because its overall point is one that I can personally relate to, at least half of its overall point, and that is that there are two major kinds of personality types, at least two kinds of people on the face of planet Earth, the public type and the private type. And of course there are all sorts of blends as well. And the wise man, we're going to see, avoids the extremes of both. In some ways, these verses tell the story of my own life, at least on the private side, because for years I was a very, very, very private person to the extreme of that personality type through things that have happened in my own life. And I have been greatly helped by what Solomon has to say here. The first and the last verses, Proverbs 18:1 and then Proverbs 18:24, give the two polar extremes when it comes to personality types. Proverbs 18:1. He who separates himself seeks his own desire and quarrels against all sound wisdom. He who separates himself seeks his own desire and quarrels against all sound wisdom. That's the private person. And then Proverbs 18:24, the last verse in the chapter. The man of many friends comes to ruin. He's talking about the extreme form of the public kind of person. And then in verse 24b, but there is a friend that sticks closer than a brother. That's the golden mean between the two extremes, as we're going to see. And the raw material of the chapter, the majority of the Proverbs that come between verse 1 and verse 24, can be organized to illustrate the foolishness of the two extremes and the wisdom of the golden mean. It's a powerful chapter. One way of viewing chapter 18 is through these bookend verses, you might say. And when you do, you get this. You get perilous personality poles that we all want to avoid. The socialite and the solitaire, or at least the extreme forms of both. And then you can view these verses that come between through the lenses of these two types. Indeed, most of the Proverbs in some way reflect on them. We'll begin this week with the pitfalls of the private life, if you're not careful. Pitfalls of the private life. He who separates himself seeks his own desire and quarrels against all sound wisdom. Some of you will notice, if you've got the King James Version, that is different there. But the Ryrie in the King James Version has a footnote that rightly points out that that's not the best rendering. The New American Standard is probably the best rendering here, which says, he who separates himself seeks his own desire and quarrels against all sound wisdom. He who separates himself. Well, first question, separates from what? The near context is in verse 24, the man of too many friends, and so this would be a man of too few friends. Further, the Hebrew word for separate that's used here, in other places in the Bible, it has to do with separating yourself from people. It's a reflexive verb in Proverbs 18, and it's the same verb with the same form is used in Judges 4:11, where we find a man named Heber, a Kenite, had separated himself from the Kenites, that is, from his own people. He pitched a tent, it says, as far away as the oak of Zananim. He had some issues with his own people, and he just said, I'm out of here. He who separates himself then from people, it means from friends, from their tribe, from their family, from the body of Christ, from relationships in general. It's an umbrella kind of a verse that can apply in a lot of ways. He who separates himself seeks his own desire and quarrels against all sound wisdom. Now, Solomon doesn't comment on the circumstance of the separation. There's just silence as to why they do it. Rather, that they do it is the main focus of the first line. Solomon purposely couches it in kind of generic language in order to capture the essence of the deed, just separating yourself from situations, from people, or whatever. This is someone who, for whatever reason, has become too much of a private person, a withdrawing type, a hermit. The form of the verb implies it's a habitual pattern that it's developed into. It's the Nephile perfect in the Hebrew, for whatever reason. You hear not a thing about the temperament of this person. You don't hear about the past trauma that may have caused him or her to distrust people. You don't hear about all the ways that he or she may have been hurt. All the demands on his or her time that make them too busy for relationships. Important though these things may be to understand, and we'll get into them in a bit, but none of them will bring any real change without fingering the sin. That's what brought change in my own life here. So what is the essence of the sin when you get into the habit of separating yourself? Well, it's selfish and it's foolish. He who separates himself seeks his own desire. The NIV translates it, an unfriendly man pursues selfish ends. Self-centered ends rather than being outward-turning and relational. He's being so selfish. He quarrels against all sound wisdom. That is, he's being foolish, or she. That's the idea. So I'd like to begin by looking at the selfishness and at the particular kind of wounded selfishness that's often found in the heart of the extreme hermit. Listen to it one more time. He who separates himself seeks his own desire. You get the feeling here that this is kind of the end of the story, and it sounds like a rather sad or a tragic story that ends up in separation, like Heber the Kenite, if you know that story. Though you never hear what's happening. Something has happened to this person, and he or she has gone into a withdrawing mode as a way of life. The cause of the withdrawal is often betrayal, real or imagined. And we can actually see some of it right here in this chapter as we start putting this proverb in its immediate context and letting Proverbs 18 explain it. Proverbs 18:19 is one way this happens. A brother offended is harder to be won than a strong city, and contentions are like the bars of a castle. This verse helps us narrow the myriads of possible applications for verse 1. A brother offended separates himself. He puts up his walls like the bars of a castle, and good luck in breaking them down. That's the idea of the verse. That's the image. A city was strong by that back then by virtue of its walls. The offended brother typically withdraws behind walls, especially if he tends to be a more private type in the first place. He puts up thick walls. Now, I find it interesting that if you move on in this chapter, Paul gives some advice here to the other side, the one who may have offended that brother, whether knowingly or unknowingly. So let's just go with the flow a bit down here, and it's around verse 19, because it will actually lead us back to our main point in verse 1. You find this advice in the verse that comes just before the one about the offended brother in verse 19, in verse 18. What do you do about such contentions when there's a contention that they withdraw from you over? The lot puts an end to contentions and decides between the mighty, someone who might have mighty anger. Back then, they sought God's will by throwing lots, and it really had influence back then, though obviously it doesn't today. And the parallel in the New Testament age would be to this advice. It's saying, if you got contentions between brethren, throw some lots, because they knew that's the way God would judge things. The advice today would be, if they've thrown up their walls against you, you better start by going to the Lord, by getting His advice, by talking to the Lord, by letting it drop first, not by talking to the person. Don't throw down the battering ram through which you're trying to get through those walls of a brother who hates you. And try breaking through instead through prayer, through seeking God. With all contentions, you'd better seek God's leading as your first plan of attack, just as Solomon said back then you do through lots. That's Solomon's advice. If you've seriously offended a brother, you need to be very careful. Sometimes you'll only make things worse if you try to get in there and solve it on your own. I don't know if you've experienced that. I sure have. Sometimes God alone is able to break down such walls. It's far more complicated than we think. And you can get into a black hole with him if you try to duke it out and argue it out and figure it out. Even happens in marriage, doesn't it? Better pray first. And break those walls down, he does. And one way he does it is by taking them by the shoulders, those who have separated themselves, and looking them in the eye and saying, just look at what you're doing. It's so selfish. A friend of mine in seminary told me that. And that's what helped turn me around. You're feeding your own desire, and we'll see just how they're doing that in a bit. So often then, the cause of the withdrawal is an offense. It's a betrayal. That's the spin of the near context of verse 19 gives to verse 1. In one broad brushstroke, the lowdown is this. He's so separated because he's so offended. He's nursing a grudge behind a wall, which is a characteristic tendency of the private type. Public type may talk too much and just get it off their chest like a shotgun blast. That's not good either. But the characteristic tendency of the private type is to maybe think about things too much and to talk too little. And that can be very dangerous too, because you're doing it behind a wall which will sometimes only grows thicker with the thinking. Now, we're going to take verse 19 as our cue and look at how the rest of the scripture fleshes this out. Verse 1. Because it underscores how common this is, how typically it happens to be betrayed and to be offended and then to be separated. And we're doing this in part because the private person, first and foremost, needs to be understood, and he needs to be made uncomfortable. He needs to get a grip. As Solomon implies here, you're being selfish, you're being foolish. To begin with, it happens because of comfortless friends. Comfortless friends. Job 6:2. Then Job answered to his friends, I have heard many such things. Sorry comforters are you all. He's getting offended at the hour of his greatest need. That can really make for thick walls when you get the opposite of what you need. In Job 6:14 he says, for the despairing man there should be kindness from his friends, lest he forsake the fear of the Almighty. Look what you're doing to me. You represent God, you're my friends, and you're not helping. Powerful instruction, but it's also a bitter accusation. Some friends you are. Many of us experience this. They were a bunch of sorry comforters, and Job took offense at them, and maybe you have too. You know, one thing Julie and I have learned in the various trials that we've gone through is that a lot of people just don't know what to say, and they put their foot in their mouths. Right? It's a rare person who can really put himself or herself into your exact shoes. In fact, there is no way we can expect them to. You don't realize this until it's your turn to go through the fire and you hear some of the same things said to you that you've said to others. In your ignorance. Each kind of suffering is so unique, and so is each person, and so are the circumstances, and so is how they happen to feel at any particular moment within those horrible circumstances, which calls out all sorts of feelings and all sorts of needs. So you've got to go to God to get it right. The right word at the right time could be completely the wrong word with the same person at some other time. And people have their own lives to live to boot, and it's not like everyone can sit around thinking about you all the time. They will not become, part of your world, especially if your suffering goes on for a long time. And so you better join their world, and you need to, lest you'll be consumed by your own world, and your suffering will never be the center of their life. Everyone else is preoccupied with everything else. It's just life under the sun, and we're not going to change it much. They don't have time to be experts on what it's like to have that problem. So what do? Well, you can either take offense at their insensitivity, and I'm pointing the finger here at myself too, and become even more separated from the body at the very time you needed them most. You can add grudges to your groaning, or you can lighten up a bit. For us, it became a matter of choosing, and we've done this over the years. When I've gone through some huge things, and we go to church, and what are we going to hear today? You know, choosing to think the loving thing in our own minds, to think 3 words. We tried to arm ourselves with these 3 words whenever we left the house, when we had deep problems with our kids, with pregnancies, infertility, or whatever. 3 words. Okay, let's just reckon this to be true. Whatever they say, they mean well. They mean well. The loving thing is to do your best just to believe all things that they mean well. There's so much here. But then it goes on to say, Job's friends didn't do that. They were miserable comforters, though they do get some unfair press. At the very beginning, they sat down and just listened to him, didn't say a word for 7 days. There's a huge lesson in that, and we could spend a sermon on how good they did it, but then it all flip-flopped, of course, as you all know, and it went south pretty fast. But I find it interesting that what God said to them when it was all over. Job 48:2. God said to these miserable comforters, he didn't say, well, look what you did to Job. You made it worse. All God said is, you've not spoken of me what is right. I'd been hurt if I were Job listening to that. Lord, rebuke them. 40 chapters of what they did. No. You've not spoken of me what is right. Not a word about what they said against Job. No comment on how they hurt him. And before he would restore Job's fortunes, he told Job to do something for them. Something that perhaps some of you have needed to do. To do something that kept him from separating himself from those comfortless friends, which he could easily have done the rest of his life. Job 42:8. Now therefore take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up a burnt offering, and my servant Job will pray for you. And the burnt offering was not for what they had done to him, but for how they had misrepresented God. And my servant Job will pray for you, that I may not do with you according to your folly. Then verse 10, the very interesting verse. The Lord restored Job's fortune when he prayed for his friends. When he did the opposite of being a brother offended and separating himself from them. He got off the pity pot and went to the mercy seat in behalf of his betrayers. There was supplication rather than separation. Restoration rather than resentment. Prosperity in his life rather than continued poverty of feeling bad for himself and pointing the finger. Because your fortunes will turn on your forgiveness. So much at stake here in separating ourselves. Yet still we do it. And a brother offended is harder to be won than a strong city. And we need to do everything we can to avoid that kind of separation. So, what's the rest of your story? You may have been separated yourself because you've been offended by comfortless friends or family, or who didn't know better maybe. You've been offended by what they did to your friends, and so you're separating from that person because of what they did to you. You've taken up an offense. So many ways that our flesh does this. Or cruel friends who did know better. The Scripture really does flesh out the rest of this story. It shows how common it is to be betrayed. It's not just you. It's not just me. It's not. We're not the only ones in the world. It's life. Cruel friends are just a part of life in a fallen world. Zechariah 13:6, prophecy about Christ. One will say to him, "What are these wounds between your arms?" Then he will say, "Those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends." Maybe it happened to you in the house of your family. Psalm 41:9, even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. Psalm 27:10, my mother and father have forsaken me. Recently, I was on the phone with a woman who was abused as a child by her father, and of course she had to work through a lot of things, but she had gotten to the point through her counseling that she's wrestled with all that's happened, and it takes time to do that, but there came a time a few weeks ago when she just had to put it behind her and leave the black hole of the past and to get a grip and to forgive and forget. Which is what the psalmist did, or he wouldn't have said, my mother and father have forsaken me, but the Lord will lift me up. He lets that happen so he can get in there and be that person that they weren't. So many different kinds of friends, comfortless friends, friends that hurt. Proverbs 26, many a man proclaims his own loyalty to your face, but who can find a trustworthy man? Proverbs 27:6, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. Why are an enemy's kisses so deceitful? Because he's talking another tune in your absence. And here's what usually happens to relationships when you find out. Once again, separation. Proverbs 17:9, he who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates intimate friends. When they repeat something about you behind your back. That is when a confidence is broken, when a friendship is betrayed by such duplicity. You get a brother offended who's harder to be won than a strong city, separated from you by a strong city wall. Because according to Proverbs 18:8, our current chapter, it's betrayal that they can't take back. The words of a whisperer, like dainty morsels, they go down into the innermost parts of the body, and you can't outlive what they say by way of gossip behind your back. It's hard. It hurts. A brother offended in this way is so hard to be won back. And yet for his sake, he better come back. Because it's selfish and it's foolish. And usually there's more than enough reason to come back. I found in my own experience because my complaint is usually not as watertight as it seems against that person. I think some people would be well advised to not to get too righteously indignant when this happens to them. Sometimes I think we all need to be a bit more stoic about life and less idealistic about what people should be like. And less demanding, like God in their lives. More like Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. I love this verse, Ecclesiastes 7:21. Do not take seriously all the words which are spoken against you, lest you hear your servant cursing you. And I would add, and you flip out and cut off the relationship. Get a grip. Do not take seriously all the words which are spoken, lest you hear your servant cursing you. For your heart knows that you have also many times cursed others. Not one of us is without sin when it comes to gossip and slander. So he's saying, quit playing the sacrificial lamb here. Some people need to lighten up, especially the private types who get so deep and nurse our wounds and who justify our withdrawal. So there's a lot here. I know there's a lot here because I've been there. I've got 4 fingers in my face. I was young when it happened to me. As most of you know, my father died when I was 6, and at the age of 6, a child usually views that as abandonment. Without ever putting it to words, my feeling was that he left me because there was something wrong with me. And for the next 20 years, I returned the favor. I forsook everyone else. I separated myself from people. I'm thinking, I'm not going there again. Look what happened when I got close back then. Without ever putting it to words, my feeling was that if I got close, they'd leave me too. And my hermit heart got bound up in wounded selfishness. Totally understandable, but selfish. The cause was the betrayal. And it was God worked in my life in a lot of ways, as I know he has you, starting when I was around 18 and had to work through some of these things. But there was one common thing over my withdrawal that I never saw. as I focused on myself, that a friend of mine, Kurt Richardson, who was my best man, pointed out to me one day in seminary. He wouldn't let me separate myself. He was God's messenger in my life, and he kept pursuing me and wanted to be with me. And we ended up praying every day in one of the prayer rooms and singing hymns together. Get that. It's a miracle for me. And we'd share about our lives, and at one point after I had shared yet again about the effect of my father's death and how hard it was to be with people, and why did God call me to be a pastor, it's so ironic, forcing me into the area of my greatest fear, he looked at me and he said, "Brian, I understand what you've been through, and it's good that you understand it too, but you're an adult now, and you're being so selfish." That got my attention. And I look back to that as the way the Spirit of God just broke my heart and broke through and opened up my heart. And now I can't imagine a place I'd rather be than interacting and being with people as what God's called me to do. And many of you have the same story. I know you do. I've talked with you.